The amount of public expenditure has increased over the years because of the increase in the activities of the government related to the welfare and the maintenance. As a result, the government finds difficult to cope up with the increasing expenditure. As a result, the government needs to borrow money from the public as well as from the institution. And this the concept which is related to the chapter, that is public debt. Now we can say that the public debt, it is the loans which is raised by the government from within the country or outside the country, and it can be borrowed from individuals, public enterprises and the banks, etc. After this, we can look into the different types of the public debt or the structure of the public debt. There can be the different types of public debt like internal and the external debt, productive and unproductive debt, redeemable and irredeemable debt, funded and unfunded debt, short-term and long-term debt, and last but not the least, that is marketable and non-marketable debt. These are the different types of public debt. Now we are going to look into the details. We are going to look into the details or the explanation of different types of public debt. First of all, let's start with the first, that is the internal and the external debt. Internal debt is that which is borrowed from within the country. From within the country, like from the people, those who are living in the country, and the different institutions which are a part and parcel of the country. Next thing which comes over here is the external debt. External debt is that which is taken from the institutions or from the government of the foreign countries. Now we can differentiate between these two also. The internal debt can be compulsorily or the voluntarily debt, whereas the external debt is only a voluntarily debt. Next category is your productive debt. Productive debt is that which is used by the government for directly productive purposes. For example, for the construction of railways, for the construction of power projects, etc. And this is the debt which increases the productive capacity of the country. So as a result, the productive debt is not a burden for the government as well for the taxpayers. Next type of debt which is there, that is a non-productive debt. And non-productive debt is that which is not used directly by the government for productive purposes. This type of debt can be used for meeting the expenditures during the wars, during the floods or any natural calamities. These type of debts do not add to the productive capacity of the country. It means that these debts do not help in increasing the production or increasing the level of the economy in any case. In other words, we can say that the unproductive debt is that which increases the burden for the government and the taxpayers as well. As a result, these type of debts are also known as the debt weight debt, because these are only the burden for the government. Next type of category which comes over here is the redeemable and irredeemable debt. First is redeemable debt. Redeemable debt is that in which the government promises to pay off the loan at some specific future date. In this, the government gives this assurance that the loan will be repaid by the government on the future date. And in this case, the interest is paid regularly. Interest is paid regularly, but the principal amount is paid after the expiry of the debt. Next category is the redeemable debt. Redeemable debt is that in which the principal amount is never returned by the government, but the interest is paid regularly by the government, but this type of debt is rarely found in any of the economy. Next category which comes over here is the funded debt and the unfunded debt. Funded debt is that in which the government establishes a separate fund to pay off the amount of loan, that is principal as well as the interest. In this, every year the government deposits a specific amount of money to the fund, and on the maturity of the debt is repaid by the government from that specific amount. And the funds are generally created by the government for the long-term debts. Long-term debts, say, for the more than 5 years. Next category which comes over here is the unfunded debt. Unfunded debts are those for which the government generally do not create any separate fund. And these debts are only for the short period of a time. Next type of debt which is there is a voluntary debt and the compulsory debt. Voluntary debt are those debts which are raised from the public without any element of compulsion or coercion. These are the debts in which the people, they give it to the government willingly on their own, without any suppression, without any force from the side of the government. On the other side, we have a compulsory debts. Compulsory debt are taken by the government against the wishes of the people. Against the wishes of the people, it means that these are the debts which are raised by the government forcefully by suppressing the people, or in other words, we can say by compelling the people to give loans to the government. But this type of debt is very unpopular and rarely used by the government in the present time, because this is the debt which spoils the image of the government, because it is completely unjust and unfair. Next type of debt we have is the short-term debt. Short-term debt is that which is raised by the government for the period of 3 to 9 months. For example, we have treasury bills. Next is the long-term debts. Long-term debts is that which is repayable by the government after a long period, say 5 years or more. But one advantage over here is this, that in the long-term debts or the long-term loans, the rate of interest is very high, which is paid by the government. Next category which comes over here is the marketable and non-marketable debt. Marketable debts are those for which the instruments can be sold in the stock market, whereas the non-marketable debts are those for which the instruments cannot be sold in the market. After looking into the various types of the debts, let's revise the types of debts. First, we have the first one category is the external and the internal debt. Second is the funded and unfunded debt. Third is redeemable and irredeemable debt. Fourth is the short-term and long-term debt. And last but not the least, we have marketable and non-marketable debt. Now, after looking into the types of the public debt, we can look into the different reasons. What are the different reasons for generating or for borrowing by the government? The first reason we have to meet the budgetary deficit. Sometimes the government finds difficult to cope up with the extra expenditure of the government in the current year. And if the government needs to cope up the current expenditure with the current revenue, the government needs to borrow. And whenever the government needs to borrow, it is generally only for the short term. Let's look into the reasons for borrowing. There can be the different reasons to borrow from the public by the government. The first reason is to meet the budgetary deficit. The government borrows to meet its current revenue expenditure. If the income from various sources falls short of current expenditure, the government borrows for the short term. And it is generally done by the countries which are underdeveloped or the developing countries of the world. Second thing which comes over here, as we all are aware that in the modern times, the wars are becoming very expensive due to the excess expenditure on the arms and ammunition, as well as on the development of the various equipments which are required during the war. As a result, the expenditure of the war cannot be met by the government without the borrowing, because the taxation cannot be increased up to certain limit. As a result, the government always finds public borrowing as an easier way to meet the expenditure of the war, to provide foreign exchange. Like in the case of the underdeveloped countries need the various or the huge amount of capital to purchase the capital equipments and the raw materials and to cover the deficit in the balance of payments. The next reason which comes over here is the government also needs to, next, the developed countries, not only the developing countries of the world, but the developed countries, they also borrow from the public, from within the country as well as from the outside the country. Like the developed countries, they borrow to control recession, which occurs due to a fall in private consumption and the investment expenditure. In this case, the government borrows from the various sources so that it can encourage the private investors, encourage the private consumers to purchase or to consume more, side by side to encourage the investors to invest more into the various projects so that the government or the economy can come out of the recession. Next thing which comes over here, the government also need to borrow to meet the unforeseen emergencies or the natural calamities like flood or earthquake, etc. Now let's recapitulate the different reasons for which we borrow, for which the government borrow from the public through various sources. The first one is to meet the budgetary deficit. Whenever the government is in problem or finds difficult to cope up with the expenditure and the revenue of the government. The government borrows from the various sources. Second, the government also borrows money from the public to meet the expenditures of the war, because the wars are very expensive nowadays. Next thing, the government also borrows from the public to meet the unforeseen emergencies, to check the recession. After looking into the various reasons for the public debt, now let's look into the what are the different